This is a true life story. Darlene Gentry lived in the quiet Texas town of Robinson, just outside Waco. To neighbors and friends, she appeared to be living a picture-perfect life, a devoted wife, a loving mother, and a woman who always smiled at church gatherings and neighborhood events. Her husband, Keith Gentry, was well-liked in the community, a hard-working man who provided for his family. Together, they were raising 3 young boys, the kind of family others looked at with admiration. But beneath the calm surface of small-town life, trouble was already forming, and no one could imagine how far it would go. The Gentrys had been together for years, and to the outside world, their marriage seemed strong. But money was always a struggle. Keith carried the weight of providing for a growing family, while Darlene, accustomed to a certain lifestyle, wanted more than what their budget could allow. Friends later recalled that she often talked about her dreams of a bigger house, nicer things, and a more comfortable life. Keith, on the other hand, focused on paying bills and keeping the family afloat. That difference slowly grew into tension. In late 2005, their relationship began to feel the strain. Behind closed doors, arguments erupted over finances, responsibilities, and the future. Still, no one expected the kind of decision Darlene would eventually make. The family still attended gatherings, took their kids to school, and kept up appearances, but under the surface, the cracks were widening. Then came the night of November 9, 2005. It was a cold evening in Robinson, and most families were already winding down for bed. But inside the Gentry home, something unthinkable was about to happen. Darlene would later tell investigators that she and Keith had been arguing earlier in the night. At some point, after things had quieted down, she said she went to bed. But in the middle of the night, Keith was found shot in the head as he slept. Emergency calls brought police and paramedics rushing to the house. Darlene told them she had discovered Keith and didn't know what happened. The scene was chaotic: 3 children in the home, neighbors awakened by flashing lights, and officers trying to make sense of what they had walked into. Keith was rushed to the hospital, but the injury was catastrophic. Not long after, he was pronounced dead. The small town was stunned. Who would want to harm Keith Gentry, a man with no known enemies? Investigators initially had no clear answers. But as they began their work, their attention quickly turned toward the one person who should have been most devastated by the tragedy: Darlene herself. She claimed she had been asleep when the gun went off. She suggested Keith may have been handling the weapon himself, an accident in the middle of the night. But detectives noticed her behavior didn't quite match the situation. Her emotions seemed uneven, her reactions rehearsed. As hours turned to days, investigators started to question her story. At first, the theory of an intruder was considered. Could someone have broken in during the night? But nothing in the house suggested forced entry. No doors had been pried open, no valuables were missing, and no signs of struggle were present. It looked less like a random crime and more like something that had happened inside the family itself. As detectives dug deeper, more troubling details emerged. They learned that in the weeks leading up to Keith's death, Darlene had been making plans that didn't align with someone devoted to her husband. She had spoken to friends about her frustrations, about how different her life could be. Most disturbing of all, police uncovered that she had recently been researching information about firearms, poisons, and even ways to make someone disappear. Still, nothing about the case was simple. Darlene maintained her innocence, insisting Keith's death was a horrible accident. She appeared at the funeral, accepted condolences, and went on with life as though she were a grieving widow. But detectives weren't convinced. And soon, evidence would surface that made their suspicions impossible to ignore. What no one in Robinson knew was that investigators were watching Darlene closely. They followed her movements, monitored her actions, and slowly built a case piece by piece. For weeks, she lived under a cloud of suspicion without even realizing how close police were to finding the truth. And then came the moment that shifted the entire investigation. Acting on a tip, detectives discovered something hidden at a pond not far from Darlene's home. What they found would unravel her story, expose her lies, and set the stage for a courtroom showdown that would keep the community on edge. But before that discovery could be revealed, Darlene's own actions would dig her deeper into a trap of her own making. And each choice she made seemed to point not to innocence, but to guilt. The days after Keith's death were filled with questions. Friends and relatives came by the Gentry home, offering food, comfort, and prayers. They expected to see a woman devastated by the sudden loss of her husband, a man who had been the backbone of her family. But instead, many quietly noticed that Darlene's grief didn't seem to match the tragedy. She cried at times, yes, but she also carried herself with a strange composure. She accepted sympathy politely, but when she thought no one was looking, her expression often appeared detached, almost distracted. Investigators were watching her closely during this time, and the more they looked, the more uneasy they became. When they reviewed the initial crime scene, one detail stood out: Keith had been shot while sleeping in bed. That meant someone had stood over him, aimed the weapon, and pulled the trigger. It didn't look like an accident. It looked intentional. And the fact that Darlene was in the house at the time left her as the only possible suspect. Still, suspicion wasn't enough. Detectives needed evidence, and they needed to understand motive. Why would Darlene Gentry want her husband dead? To answer that question, they started digging into her financial life. And what they uncovered revealed the darker side of a woman who had carefully crafted the image of a perfect wife and mother. Darlene had been struggling with money for years. Bills were piling up, credit cards were stretched, and her desire for a lifestyle beyond their means had created a strain. Investigators soon learned that she had taken out significant life insurance policies on Keith, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. If Keith were gone, Darlene stood to gain financially in a way that could erase her money problems instantly. The life insurance revelation changed everything. Suddenly, Keith's death wasn't just a family tragedy. It looked like a calculated plan. A plan that only Darlene could benefit from. But police knew a case like this couldn't be rushed. If they moved too quickly, she could walk free forever. So they waited, gathering information quietly, interviewing friends, co-workers, and relatives. Piece by piece, they painted a picture of a woman who had grown tired of her marriage, overwhelmed by debt, and who saw her husband not as a partner but as an obstacle. And then Darlene made a mistake. Investigators noticed she was acting strangely in the days after Keith's death. Instead of focusing on her children, or leaning on family for support, she began taking late-night trips, slipping away when no one expected her to be out. Detectives decided to follow her. One night, surveillance teams watched as Darlene drove to a remote pond outside of town. She carried items with her and walked toward the water. When she left, investigators searched the spot she had visited. What they pulled from the pond shocked even seasoned officers. Inside the murky water, wrapped and weighted, was the murder weapon, the gun used to kill Keith Gentry. This discovery shattered any defense Darlene might have claimed. The very gun that ended her husband's life was hidden by her own hands. To prosecutors, it was clear she hadn't been a grieving wife. She had been covering her tracks, trying to make sure no one could prove what she had done. But Darlene wasn't arrested immediately. Investigators wanted to make sure the case was airtight. They brought her in for questioning again, pressing her about inconsistencies in her story. Each time, she stuck to her claim of innocence. She said she didn't know what had happened, that Keith's death must have been a tragic accident. But detectives knew better. They had the gun, and they had her actions caught on surveillance. As the net closed in, Darlene's behavior grew more bizarre. Instead of showing fear or remorse, she carried on with daily life, attending community events, even smiling at gatherings. To outsiders, it seemed almost unthinkable. How could a woman accused of such a terrible act behave so casually? But for investigators, it only confirmed what they had begun to suspect. Darlene lacked the emotional depth of someone truly mourning. The community of Robinson was torn. Many couldn't believe Darlene was capable of killing Keith. To them, she was a sweet, church-going mother who had always seemed devoted to her family. Others, however, began to whisper about the cracks they had noticed, the complaints about money, the quiet frustrations about her marriage, the restless desire for more than Keith could provide. The case soon captured the attention of local media. Headlines painted Darlene as a woman leading a double life, the perfect mother in public, but behind the scenes, a wife plotting her husband's death. And with the trial approaching, the truth of who she really was would finally be laid bare. The evidence against her was powerful. The life insurance motive, the weapon found in the pond, the inconsistencies in her story, and her suspicious behavior in the days after Keith's death. Yet even as prosecutors built their case, Darlene refused to admit guilt. She continued to maintain her innocence, leaving the final decision in the hands of a jury. For the people of Robinson, the wait for justice felt endless. Each day brought new revelations, each headline brought more shock. And as the trial neared, it became clear that the truth about Darlene Gentry would not only change her family forever, but would leave an entire town shaken to its core. Because what began as the tragic death of a husband was now revealed as something far darker, the deliberate act of a wife who chose money and freedom over the man she had vowed to love. And with the trial about to begin, the question was no longer if Darlene was guilty. It was how much evidence the jury would need before sealing her fate. The closer investigators looked at Darlene, the more contradictions emerged. Her friends described her as ambitious, always wanting to move forward, always striving for something bigger than what she had. On the surface, that was admirable, but in marriage it had turned into a source of tension. Keith had been practical, satisfied with a steady job, steady income, and a simple life raising their children. Darlene, however, wanted more, a bigger house, better clothes, vacations, the lifestyle she believed she deserved. Those who knew them best remembered how arguments often circled back to money. Keith complained that she spent too freely, while Darlene accused him of holding her back. The disagreements were private, but they chipped away at what had once been a strong bond. By the time Keith changed jobs to be closer to home, the financial strain was already heavy, and Darlene's patience was running thin. Detectives interviewed co-workers at the hospital where Darlene worked as a nurse. Several remembered that she complained often about her marriage, voicing frustrations about being tied down, about not having the freedom she wanted. While no one thought she was capable of violence, those words took on new weight in the aftermath of Keith's death. Meanwhile, forensic experts dug deeper into the evidence. The gloves found in the trash, the shell casing, the trajectory of the bullet, all told a story that matched their suspicions. The shot had been fired at close range, aimed with precision at a sleeping man who never had a chance to defend himself. And the idea of a burglar didn't match the facts. Nothing of real value had been taken, the back door appeared staged, and the placement of the guns outside the home looked deliberate, not desperate. In cases like this, prosecutors often face an uphill battle without eyewitnesses. But here, the circumstances painted a clear picture. Only one person had motive, access, and opportunity. And that person was Darlene. As weeks passed, community support began to shift. At first, many rallied around her, bringing meals, offering to watch the children, speaking words of comfort. But once the revelations about the life insurance policy and the gun in the pond became public, people grew uneasy. Neighbors whispered to one another, questioning whether they had ever really known the woman next door. Some admitted they had seen her differently after Keith's death, noting how quickly she seemed to adjust, how her tears seemed brief, and how she didn't cling to her children the way they expected a grieving mother would. Behind the scenes, prosecutors built a timeline of her actions. They argued that the night of November 8, 2005, was not a night of chance, but of careful planning. After dinner with friends, Darlene returned home to an argument over spending. Later, once Keith was asleep, she retrieved the revolver, fired the fatal shot, and staged the scene to look like a break-in. Then, in the days after, realizing investigators were circling, she disposed of the weapon in the pond, hoping to erase the final piece of evidence. What she hadn't counted on was the persistence of local law enforcement, or the willingness of Robert Pavavila, the landowner, to speak up when she asked him to fill in the pond. His decision to contact authorities was a turning point. Without him, the gun might never have been recovered. With him, prosecutors had a smoking gun both literally and figuratively. When Darlene learned the weapon had been found, she didn't panic outwardly. She maintained her innocence, insisting she knew nothing about the gun's presence in the water. But investigators already had the surveillance footage of her wading into the pond, poking around the very spot where the revolver had been recovered. That footage would later become the centerpiece of the trial, a moment impossible for her defense to explain away. At Keith's funeral, emotions ran high. Friends and family mourned the loss of a man described as selfless and steady, someone who had lived for his children and sacrificed for his wife. Darlene was there, dressed in black, crying at moments, holding her son's hands. But those closest to Keith couldn't shake the feeling that something about her presence was off. Her gestures seemed more for show than from the heart. Some whispered that she was playing a part, that she knew eyes were on her, and she wanted to maintain her image as the grieving widow. The investigation dragged on for months, and during that time, the Gentry family faced an impossible choice. Keith's parents, who had initially defended Darlene, began to feel the weight of the evidence. They wanted to believe in her innocence, but they also wanted justice for their son. As guardians of the three young boys, they were torn between loyalty to the woman who had been their daughter-in-law and the need to protect their grandchildren from the reality that their mother may have killed their father. Prosecutors finally decided to act. On November 28, 2005, they arrested Darlene and charged her with murder. For a brief moment, it seemed justice had arrived. But then, in a twist that stunned many, Keith's parents posted bond for her release. They couldn't yet bring themselves to believe she was guilty. To them, she was still the mother of their grandsons, a woman they had trusted and embraced. Darlene walked free, but she was under a spotlight. Reporters followed her every move, neighbors watched with suspicion, and detectives kept gathering evidence. It was during this time that she returned to the pond, unaware that police had already drained it and recovered the gun. Believing she might still be able to erase her crime, she stepped into the water with boots and a rod, searching the spot. But hidden cameras captured every second. The footage was damning, and once prosecutors had it, they knew their case was unshakable. By early 2007, preparations for trial were underway. Darlene's defense team struggled to counter the mountain of evidence. They argued she was a loving wife, a dedicated nurse, and a mother of three who had no reason to kill her husband. But the prosecution's case told a darker story, one of financial desperation, emotional dissatisfaction, and a plan carried out in cold blood. The trial opened to packed courtrooms and heavy media coverage. Every detail was dissected, from the shell casing in the gloves to the surveillance video at the pond. Witnesses testified about Darlene's spending habits, about her marriage troubles, about the life insurance policy. Forensic experts walked the jury through the trajectory of the bullet and the timeline of Keith's final moments. And throughout it all, Darlene sat quietly, her face betraying little. Some jurors later said they looked for signs of remorse, but saw only composure. When the video of her searching the pond was played in court, the room fell silent. It was the moment that sealed her fate. After just 5 days of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was 60 years in prison. Darlene showed little visible reaction as the words were read. Her life, once filled with promise and ambition, was now confined to a prison cell. For Keith's family, the verdict was both a relief and a heartbreak. They had lost a son, a brother, a father, and now they had to face the truth that his death had come at the hands of the woman he trusted most. The custody of the children was awarded to Keith's parents, ensuring they would be raised away from the shadow of their mother's crime. In the years since, Darlene has maintained her innocence, appealing her conviction, but each attempt has been denied. She remains behind bars, with parole eligibility set decades in the future. Her sons have grown up without her, guided instead by the grandparents who stepped in to provide the stability she destroyed. The story of Keith and Darlene Gentry stands as a tragic reminder of how love can turn into betrayal, how ambition and financial pressure can twist into desperation, and how a single moment of violence can change the course of countless lives. And for the people of Robinson, the memory lingers. The quiet town, once known for its peace and simplicity, became the setting of a story that shocked Texas and still resonates to this day. The trial of Darlene Gentry did more than determine guilt or innocence. It exposed the undercurrents of a marriage that, to the outside world, had once looked perfect. It forced jurors, neighbors, and even close family members to ask themselves how well they really knew the people around them. For the Gentry family, it was a devastating reckoning. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution built their case meticulously. They began with the physical evidence, the revolver recovered from the pond, the gloves in the trash, the single shell casing that told the story of a point-blank execution. Each piece fit together like puzzle fragments, leaving little room for alternative explanations. Then came the witnesses. Former co-workers of Darlene described a woman who, while professional and competent, often spoke of financial stress and of frustrations with her husband. Friends testified about her desire for a bigger life, about her interest in moving into a newly built house, and about arguments she had over Keith's unwillingness to stretch the family budget. But it was the testimony of investigators that hit the hardest. One after another, they detailed the inconsistencies in Darlene's statements, the way her account of the night kept shifting, and the implausibility of her version of events. They reminded the jury that there had been no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a violent burglar. Instead, there had been a carefully staged scene. When the prosecution finally played the surveillance footage of Darlene at the pond, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Jurors leaned forward. Reporters scribbled notes. The grainy video showed her stepping into the shallow water, scanning the surface, poking into the mud with a stick, and returning again and again to the precise area where the revolver had been hidden. To many in the room, that moment crystallized the case. The defense fought back with the tools they had. They painted Darlene as a hard-working nurse, a loving mother, and a woman overwhelmed by grief. They emphasized that she had no prior criminal record, no history of violence, nothing that pointed to a cold-blooded killer. They argued that the case was built on circumstantial evidence and suspicion, not definitive proof. Yet, the jurors could not ignore the weight of the evidence. Circumstantial or not, it all pointed in one direction. As the trial drew to a close, closing arguments offered starkly different portraits of Darlene Gentry. The prosecution described her as a woman who had grown impatient with her husband, who saw financial struggles as chains keeping her from the life she wanted, and who ultimately decided to remove Keith from the equation. The defense portrayed her as a victim of tragedy and suspicion, caught in a narrative she did not create. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Their verdict was swift and unanimous: guilty of murder. The sentence of 60 years in prison was handed down shortly after. In the courtroom, Keith's family wept. They had fought for justice for their son and finally achieved it, but the cost was staggering. 3 young boys were now without both parents, one buried in the ground, the other confined to a prison cell. For Darlene, the sentence meant a lifetime defined by regret and isolation. As she was led away in handcuffs, observers noted her composure. Some said she looked resigned, others thought she appeared defiant, still unwilling to accept responsibility for what she had done. Outside the courthouse, reporters captured the raw emotions of the day. Keith's mother spoke briefly, her voice trembling as she described her relief that justice had been served. But she also admitted that her heart was broken, not only for the loss of her son but for the future of her grandchildren. The boys were placed in the custody of Keith's parents, who stepped into the role of guardians with both love and grief. For them, raising the children was both a blessing and a heavy responsibility. They wanted to give the boys a normal life, shield them from the harsh truths of their parents' story, yet they knew that one day the questions would come. In prison, Darlene adjusted to a world far removed from the one she had known. Gone were the long shifts at the hospital, the evenings with friends, the plans for the future. Instead, there was the routine of incarceration: counts, meals, chores, and the weight of time stretching endlessly ahead. Despite the verdict, she never wavered in her claims of innocence. In interviews and appeals, she insisted she had been wrongfully convicted, that she had no reason to harm Keith, and that the evidence had been twisted against her. Her appeals were denied, each one reinforcing the permanence of her conviction. For those who studied the case, Darlene's insistence raised difficult questions. Was it denial, an inability to confront the enormity of her actions? Was it a strategy, an attempt to preserve dignity in the face of shame? Or was it, however unlikely, the faint possibility that she truly believed in her innocence? Psychologists who followed the case pointed to patterns seen in other domestic homicides. The blend of financial stress, marital dissatisfaction, and the allure of a life insurance payout created a toxic mix. In such cases, the perpetrator often convinces themselves that the murder is a solution, that it will open the door to a new beginning. But the reality is always the opposite: destruction that ripples outward through families, communities, and generations. The Gentry case also became a cautionary tale about appearances. On the surface, Darlene had been the picture of success: a nurse, a wife, a mother, a member of her community. Beneath that image, however, was resentment, financial pressure, and a willingness to cross a line few could imagine. In the years that followed, true crime documentaries, podcasts, and television programs revisited the case. Each one dissected the details, from the evidence in the pond to the courtroom drama. Audiences were fascinated and horrified by the story of a woman who appeared to have it all, yet threw it away in a single violent act. For the residents of Robinson, the story lingered long after the cameras left. Some struggled to reconcile their memories of Darlene as a friendly neighbor with the reality of her crime. Others avoided speaking of the case altogether, preferring not to relive the painful chapter. Meanwhile, Keith's sons grew up under the care of their grandparents. Shielded from the media, they built lives as normal as possible under the circumstances. For them, the absence of both parents was a defining fact of childhood. One day, as they reached adulthood, they would learn the full truth, a truth that could not be softened, only faced. The legal system had done its part, delivering justice according to the evidence. But justice in cases like these is never complete. A man lost his life, children lost their parents, and two families were torn apart. No sentence could undo that. As the years passed, some continued to speculate about Darlene's state of mind. Was it greed alone that drove her? Or was it a mix of dissatisfaction, entitlement, and desperation? Perhaps it was not one single factor, but a convergence of them all. In the years after the trial, the case of Darlene Gentry never truly faded from public memory. It lived on in quiet conversations around Robinson, in the lives of Keith's children, and in the minds of those who had once called Darlene a friend, a neighbor, or even a role model. Her conviction marked the end of the courtroom battle, but not the end of the story. In prison, she settled into the monotony of long sentences, where days blurred into weeks and weeks into years. Fellow inmates described her as polite, reserved, someone who kept to herself. But behind that calm exterior was a reality she could never escape. She had exchanged her freedom for a decision that took her husband's life. Outside those prison walls, the world continued to turn. Keith's family worked tirelessly to provide stability for his 3 sons. They wanted the boys to remember their father not for the way he died, but for the life he lived, hard-working, dependable, devoted to them. Photographs, stories, and memories became lifelines, keeping his presence alive even as time moved on. But as the boys grew older, the questions deepened. They learned more of the truth, that their father's death was not random, not a tragic accident, but a deliberate act carried out by their mother. For children to carry that weight is something most people cannot imagine. Yet they faced it with strength, guided by grandparents who refused to let the tragedy define them. For criminologists and true crime followers, the case became more than just another headline. It was dissected in classrooms, discussed in podcasts, and analyzed on television. People wanted to understand how an ordinary woman, with no history of crime, could reach the point of murder. The answer, many concluded, was not a single moment but a buildup of pressures: financial stress, marital dissatisfaction, and the lure of life insurance money. It was not sudden. It was the result of choices layered over time. But there was another layer too: psychology. Experts studying the case noted how Darlene seemed detached after the crime, how her grief didn't match the gravity of her husband's death. Some suggested narcissistic traits, pointing to her need for control, her focus on appearances, and her refusal to admit guilt. Others describe her actions as those of someone driven not by rage, but by cold calculation. The discovery of the gun in the pond remained the most damning moment of the investigation. To many, it symbolized everything: a secret act meant to erase the truth, undone by her own hands. Without it, the case might have dragged on in uncertainty. With it, the story was sealed. And yet, despite overwhelming evidence, Darlene never confessed. Even years later, in prison interviews, she maintained her innocence. That refusal became one final wound for Keith's family. To them, an admission of guilt might have provided closure. Instead, they were left with silence and denial. As time passed, documentaries returned to the story. Viewers across the country watched, horrified yet fascinated, as the narrative unfolded. A smiling nurse. A loving mother. A husband gone. A gun in a pond. The contrast between the surface and the reality made it unforgettable. For the community of Robinson, the case was a lasting reminder that appearances can be deceiving. People who once waved to Darlene at church or chatted with her at the grocery store now remembered her as the woman who murdered her husband. Trust had been broken, and the scar remained. The legacy of the case was not just about crime and punishment. It was about the ripples that spread outward: children forced to grow up with a painful truth, parents who lost a son, neighbors who questioned their own ability to see danger close to home. And at the center of it all was one decision, a choice made in the dark of night, in the quiet of a bedroom, when one life ended and countless others were shattered. Today, Darlene Gentry continues to serve her sentence, her name forever tied to the crime that destroyed her family. Keith is remembered by those who loved him as more than a victim. He was a father, a son, a friend, a man whose life was cut short by someone he trusted most. In the end, this case stands as a chilling reminder. Sometimes, the greatest threats do not come from strangers, but from the people closest to us. This is the story of Darlene Gentry. A story of love turned to loss, of trust turned to betrayal, and of justice carried out in the face of tragedy. And for the rest of us, it is a reminder that behind every headline is a family forever changed. This is a true life story. For more true life stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.